excited to be in this series. This is my story. And last week, you heard a powerful testimony that God did in the work of Michael Clark, in the life of Michael Clark. And we were just blessed by that. And I hope that you were able to participate in that, whether it was here in person or online. You were able to watch that and hear the ways God had been at work. See, we've been in these series where the miracles of Jesus, and now we're going to transition into This Is My Story. It doesn't matter if we have done right our whole life or been in prison, we all need Jesus. Right? We all need Jesus. We need a Savior. We don't do it on our own. We simply encounter who He is, follow Him, and watch how grace and unconditional love changes our lives. Over the next several weeks, we're going to get to see how the story of God, the story of resurrection, the story of redeeming grace, the story of all these things take place and how it can be our story. That can be the story that we choose. And so I'm excited as we anticipate Easter coming, and I hope that you come and join next week with the Easter egg hunt and then participate in Holy Week and the many things we have plans. But I love a great story. I love a great story. I love to go. The men meet on Tuesdays and sit at the breakfast table. And I love just opportunities like that where I can go and hear a story of just how someone grew up or what they used to do, or just hear these great stories that take place. We all read stories growing up through kids' books. I read them to my kids now. And we've read books about giving trees and green eggs and ham and Winnie the Pooh and a dog named Clifford. And we hear these stories, and we really like the ones that have happy endings. If you're a little I'm going to say crazy. If you're a little, you like the cliffhangers where they just completely leave it open to your imagination on how it ends, hoping that there's another book coming or a second one coming that explains it a little bit more. But I'm just going to be honest with you. Growing up, I picked the stories or the books that had the most pictures. Anybody else? Okay, less words, more pictures. That's how I learned. All right, but it's who we are. And with every good story, there are 5 essential components. Anybody know them? There's a plot, there's a setting, there's characters, there's a point of view, and conflict. And then within the plot of this story, there are even 5 parts on its own. There's an exposition, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and resolution. Not only are these keys to a great story, but the author of the story matters. You ready? If I were to ask you who the author of these books are, who would you say? Hang on. Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, The Lorax, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. Who would you say that is? Yeah, you know it by who the author is, right? That's how you know these different things. See, we all have a story. And when we think about our story, somewhere in the middle of the plot, the point of view, the conflict, the rising action, the climax, and the resolution is a story that God has woven together. See, there is a story that God is still authoring. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, whether you've come in and you've just got baggage, or you've got a history, or you've got one, there is somewhere in the middle of the plot, the conflict, the rising action in all of us, a story that God is authoring. Pastor Mark and I got to sit down and interview someone special this week that I don't know if you know much about our story and the church's story, but it's so unique to me, right? It's so special to me. We're going to hear in just a moment a little bit about that, but we got to sit down and a few things we discovered. We're celebrating 75 years this year, 75 years in the church's history. That's pretty impressive. That's something to be proud of when we look back, and hopefully we'll be planning some things to celebrate that together. But we've also gotten to hear how God has been authoring Restoration Church. Now, we've had different names at times, and we've probably been made up of some different people, right? But God has been there authoring our story from the very beginning. He has been the one that has gone through it all. And so we're going to take a few minutes and just hear a little bit about our story now.
My name is Marilyn Mundy. And this is my story of the church, of how it got started. it started from the Nazarene boys. They had an all-night prayer meeting, and there was about 6 or 7 boys at that church. And we just had girls at our church at Faith Mission. So they went to Brother Davis and asked if he would get them a building. So a year later, in 1949, he rented it's a tavern now on 7th Street. And we had the girls and the ones from Faith Mission and the Nazarene boys all got together and had Sunday schools and services in the little building. And then it grew. And then one of the boys, which was called Bill Jackson, he was the preacher. And my husband played guitar. So that was the music. And they put a tent up out here. And they had a tent revival. And later on then, that's when they decided to put the basement in. They put the basement in, and I know it was in 1950 because my cousin got married down there the same week that I got married, only I got married in the Faith Mission Church. And we did marry boys from the Nazarene Church. We had one revival that Delano Jackson got saved in. And that revival went on for almost a month. I mean, night after night after night. And so many people Delano was one of them that finally made the move. There has been 6 generations that's come through here. My grandmother, my dad and mom, me, Dixie's kids, and Dixie's grandkids. I don't think they really realized what it really was to start out with. They thought it was just a little Sunday school class, just in the afternoon for kids in that end of town. But I don't think they really realized and dreamed that one day this church would be as big as it is.
I love a good story. I do. I love a good story. And if you go online, you'll see a little bit more about that story. I can imagine some boys in high school who get out early, could have chosen to do a million other things, could have chosen to do anything, but they used what is now a tavern and eventually a tent, and then met in the basement of the church, and they began to just, out of a Sunday school class, out of a prayer meeting, allow God to author what he wanted. Right? Allow God to continue to author. And if you go online, you'll see something along the lines of a story about how the water would come in the basement, and you know what they'd do? They just moved the chairs. They just moved the chairs, and they kept meeting in there. And it says on there that people didn't come back because of the building. They didn't come back because of anything. They came back because the presence of the Lord was evident. I love that. I love that story. We all have a story. But there's something beautiful and there's something special about allowing God to be the author of it. It says in Hebrews chapter 12, if you have your Bibles, in verse 2, I'm going to read 2 different versions of this passage. One is NIV and one is King James Version. But it says this: fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. What does allowing God to be the author of our story look like? Fixing our eyes on him. Right? Fixing our eyes on him and allowing the pioneer and perfecter of our faith to go to work. It says this in King James: looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Looking unto Jesus, which is who? The author and finisher of our faith. And I don't want to read that part and then leave out the second, who for the joy. It says, joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. I'm so glad that as we look back at the church, we see God authoring, not just then, but authoring us now into the present. He really is the author and pioneer of our faith. But what does that look like? If we dive into the Greek meaning here of the word author in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it means this: the chief leader, the prince, one that takes the lead in anything. I love that definition. The one who takes the lead in anything. And then if we look at what a pioneer looks like and what that means, it means this. This is the same word from which we get architect. A person skilled in the art of building, one who plans and designs buildings and supervises their construction. We have a God who is leading us, and a God who has plans and designs for us, and whose Son, as Hebrews says, joyfully endured the cross. Let that sink in. That's the God we serve. That is who we get to worship. That we have a God who says, I want to be the author, right? I want to help pioneer. I want to help do these things, and whose my Son is going to joyfully endure the cross, despising its shame, and is now at the right hand of the throne of God. What does all this tell me about our story? It says this: our story is not based on us writing it. Instead, our story can be the result of God's love for us. Think about that for a minute. Our story, the ones you and I have, the one that restoration has. Yeah, our names changed, but if you look back, you can see that it wasn't about us writing it. It doesn't have to be about us writing it, but it gets to be a direct result of God's love for us. How many of us have tried to write our own story? What do I mean by that? These are blank papers. I try to find ones that had, the lines and the margins and different things. But maybe for many of us, we've tried to write our own story. We've sat down and we've made plans and we've written out, I want to be a teacher. And we go along and we say, that didn't quite work as well. That isn't working. I'm gonna be this, and I'm by the time I'm 30, I'm gonna have a house. That didn't work out too well, did it? And so we began to write these different things, and maybe you set out and you said, "Hey, I'm gonna get married, and I've dreamed of this day my whole life, and I've longed for it, and I never imagined the day would come when maybe it just didn't pan out." And so you say, that's not good either. And maybe for some of us, it's even retiring. Hey, I want to retire by this age, and I'm going to make sure I've got all my finances in order and my health. But because of it, I'm just not going to be able to retire in the way that I want. So that's out the window. Or maybe it's habits, and it's hang-ups, and it's mistakes that we keep getting in the way of ourselves. And what we keep doing and we keep saying is, just not working out. Can I tell you this morning, you're not junk. You're not junk. You're not the trash that you see. Your story and the story that others have written about yourself, you are not that. Right? You are not that. We have been given the opportunity to allow God to be the author of our story and allow our story to be a result of His love for us. God loves you, and God has plans and desires for you. It says in Psalm 139, we're going to read that in just a minute, but it says this: your works, meaning God's works, are what? Are wonderful. They're wonderful works of God. So you don't have to sit here and plan your story. You don't have to write it out as if everything's got to be there, and then when it messes up, you got to crumble it up and throw it away. That's not true. That's not who God is and what He desires for your life. It says this in Psalms 139. It's a passage where we really get to see what God's had in mind the whole time. That from the beginning to the end, God has had creation in mind. He's had you and I in mind from the very beginning. It says, "For you created my inmost being, and you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body, and all the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. In this particular moment, the psalmist is writing out of appreciation and gratitude. They recognize the plans, the works that God has in their life. And what that works looks like is grace. It's love, it's gratitude, and it leaves us filled. And they recognize the results of God being the author of their story, and what that really looks like is a story of grace. See, we don't have to be the stories that we're writing or that others are writing about us. We can truly allow God to be the author of our story. And when we do that, it's far more than we could ever imagine. There's a story I'm going to try and share each week, not this story, but I'm going to try and share a story each week as we go through this. We're going to see some stories and testimonies of people here in our church, but I also want to share a story. And I was thinking about what God's grace looks like in our lives. I was thinking about what it really looks like to allow His compassions, to allow His love, to allow who He is, to allow the stories that Psalms 139 really talks about, to allow all that come true. What does that look like in the end? I came across this story about a young girl who gets to go to Disney World. And it says this, and I'm going to read it. Okay, this is the story of her father recalling what took place. And so I'm just going to read it, if you will, but I hope you can follow with me this morning. I never dreamed that taking a child to Disney World would be so difficult, or that such a trip could teach me so much about God's outrageous grace. Our middle daughter had been previously adopted by another family. I'm sure this couple had the best of intentions, but they never quite integrated the adopted child into their family of the biological children. After a couple of rough years, they dissolved the adoption, and we ended up welcoming an 8-year-old girl into our home. For one reason or another, whenever our daughter's previous family vacationed at Disney World, they took their biological children with them, but they left their adopted daughter with a family friend. Usually, at least in the child's mind, this happened because she did something wrong that precluded her presence on the trip. And so, by the time we adopted our daughter, she had seen many pictures of Disney World. And she had heard about the rides and the characters and the parades. But when it came to passing through the gates of the Magic Kingdom, she had always been the one left out on the outside. Once I found out about this history, I made plans to take her to Disney World the next time a speaking engagement took our family to the southeastern United States. I thought I had mastered the Disney World drill. I knew the previous experiences, that the prospect of seeing cast members in freakishly oversized mouse and duck costumes somehow turns children into squirming bundles of emotional instability. What I didn't expect was the prospect of visiting the dream world would produce a stream of downright devilish behavior in our newest daughter. In the month leading up to the trip to the Magic Kingdom, she stole food when she simply could have just asked for it. She lied when it would have been easier to tell the truth. She whispered insults that were carefully crafted to hurt her older sister and deeply as possible. And as the days on the calendar moved closer to the trip, her behavior got worse. A couple of days before our family headed to Florida, I pulled our daughter into my lap to talk through her latest episodes. I know what you're going to do, she replied. You're not going to take me to Disney World, are you? The thought hadn't actually crossed my mind, but her downright spiral behavior suddenly started to make some sense. She knew she couldn't earn her way into the Magic Kingdom. She had tried and failed that test several times before. So she was living the way that placed her as far as possible from the most magical place on earth. In retrospect, I'm embarrassed to admit that in that moment, I was tempted to turn her fear to my own advantage. The easiest response would have been, if you don't start behaving better, you're right, we won't take you. But by God's grace, I didn't. Instead, I asked her, is this trip something we're going to do as a family? She nodded, brown eyes wide open. Are you part of this family? She nodded again. Then you're going with us. Sure, there may be some consequences to help you remember what's right and wrong, but you're part of our family and we're not leaving you behind. I'd like to say that things grew better after that moment, but they didn't. Her choices pretty much spiraled out of control. At every stop, at every hotel on the way down there, it just continued to get worse. Still, we headed to Disney World on the day we had promised. And it was typical Disney day. Overpriced tickets, overpriced meals, lots of lines, mingled with just enough manufactured magic to consider maybe going again someday. In our hotel room that evening, a very different child emerged. She was exhausted. She was tired and a little weepy at times. But her month-long behavior and rebellion had faded. When bedtime rolled around, I prayed with her and held her and asked, so how was your first day at Disney World? She closed her eyes, snuggled down into her stuffed unicorn. After a few moments, she opened her eyes ever so slightly. Daddy, she said, I finally got to go to Disney World. But it wasn't because I was good. It was because I'm yours. I finally got to go, but it wasn't because I was good. It was because I'm yours. I asked you at the beginning, and I want to ask you now, who is the one writing your story? I pray this morning that it is God, because God has a story for us that is far greater than we could imagine. And it's not because we are good. It's not because we've done everything right. It's because we have a choice to get to be His. There's a difference. We get to choose to be His. We get to allow Him to be the authors of our story. No matter how it starts, no matter good or bad, how it's going, we get to allow God to be the authors of our stories. See, when we allow God to write our story, we realize that the story being written goes from trash to the fridge. Anybody ever hang their stuff up on the fridge? You know, you came home from school and it said A+, and you were like, look, Mom and Dad, I'm hanging that up on the fridge, right? Instead of being something that's crumbled up and thrown away, we're hanging it on the fridge for everybody to see. And guess what? It wasn't because you and I did anything. All we did was allow God to be the author of it. All we did was say, you know what? I want to be yours. And in return, I want you to write my story. And I want to lean into the plans and the desires and the grace and the love that you have for my life. And one of my favorite things at the end of the video that you saw earlier is we asked, could you imagine where we are today? And she basically just said, no, I never could. I can't imagine. I don't think when they started out as a small Sunday school class, they would have ever imagined where we are today. You know why? Because that's what God does. That's what God does when He becomes the author of the things that we are desiring. I love this church's story. I love the power in a story where God is the author. And if God can author a few high school boys who get out of school early and choose to pray and seek Him and allow Him to be the author of their steps and the author of their ways, look what happens. Far more than we could ever dream or imagine. And it's not because we're good. It's simply because we're choosing to just be His. I'm going to call Pastor Mark back up to play in just a few moments. And as he does, I want to read from John chapter 3, verse 29 through 30. And John the Baptist is speaking here, and he testifies again about Jesus. And he says this: the bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. You know what John says about that? He says, that joy is mine and it is now complete. And then in verse 30, he must become greater and I must become less. What John is saying is, hey, Jesus, when He becomes greater in our lives and we wait and we listen and we allow Him to direct our ways, we allow Him to be the author of our stories, that joy becomes complete. Because it's not about us, it's about who He is. He really is the author and pioneer of you and I. He really is the author and pioneer of this church. He really is the reason why we get to say, this is my story, why we get to look at the resurrection, and why we get to look at Jesus dying on the cross and saying, that was for me, and it has become my story, but it's really just the one I get to go and tell because it's what God has already authored in me. I'm just choosing to embrace it. I'm choosing to live in it. I'm choosing to allow him to become greater so that I can become less.